좋아요, 구독! 월가 트레이더 버니의 미국 주식 시간으로 돌아왔습니다. 미국 시카고 현재 계시는 버니 씨와 함께 이 뉴욕 증시 이슈에 대해서 자세하게 다뤄보는 시간인데요. 오늘 같은 경우는 2분기 실적 발표가 된 애플에 대해서 분석을 좀 해주신다고 합니다. 관련돼서 애플을 매수하기 좋은 타이밍은 언젠지 귀 기울여 들어보시면 좋을 것 같습니다. 함께 보시죠.
So over the course of the last 11 years, Apple has been, and even longer than that, in terms of its relationship to the stock market, it's been one of the best stocks to own. So let's now take a look. I don't think there's anything new to Apple relative to what's gone on before. So I don't think there's a big change. I don't think there's anything new. There may be a new product coming out, but sometimes we don't know that until September, October, when they release all their new product information. But let's just look at Apple as a whole and identify what we think of that. So now what I'm looking at here is as Apple stock, just generally speaking, we've got momentum on top, and we can see that Apple has just taken out its late September, early October lows. It did so with a new low, but we have positive momentum divergences here. We still have negative momentum, okay? And we can see for most of this year that negative momentum has occurred. We'd like it to get back above zero so we can get that positive momentum like we saw for most of last year. When we look at Apple and compare it to their computer hardware sector, and that ETF that represents computer hardware, where Apple is a big component of that. What we want to look at is, just generally speaking, here's the computer hardware sector as a whole. So similar performance, generally speaking, that Apple had. But it didn't quite make a new low, and when we compare Apple to that consumer hardware sector, we can see that positive divergence where Apple is outperforming the computer hardware sector. We can also see that Apple's outperforming the S&P 500 as a whole. And then when we look at the computer hardware sector, that's also starting to outperform the S&P 500. It's hard to say, but we're looking at it really narrowly, but I think it's starting to outperform a little bit. So we want to think about now, if we're going to buy a market leader, and Apple stays to be a market leader, which there's no reason to believe it won't, what's happened to the stock market after we've gone down for two significant quarters in a row, gone down significantly for 2 quarters in a row? And we can see that during these periods, the orange bars represent 1 quarter out, the gray bars represent 6 months out, and the yellow bars represent 1 year out. We can see, typically speaking, that we've had really nice performance more often than not 6 months out and a year out, as opposed to 1 quarter out. But 1 quarter out has not been bad. So we've averaged 8.5% 1 quarter out, averaged 21.5% 6 months out, and averaged 31.5% 1 year out. So if we can get a bounce back in stocks, and I do believe stocks are probably going to have a good fourth quarter of this year and a decent second half of this year, that Apple may be one of those stocks that we can purchase at this stage in the game right here. We want to be able to look for higher momentum. Now we want to think about also, we just had a interest rate hike in June, and we had that interest rate hike right in front of a big option expiration, where we had a significant, in fact, the most significant put ownership of options that we've had all year long. So we had a put-call ratio on a 5-day basis that was the highest of this year, right on the tail of a Fed rate hike, a 75 basis point rate hike. And then we go back and we look at July 1st to 15th typically has been a very positive time for the stock market. Not necessarily all summer, but July 1st to 15th. Now, if we couple that with all of those shorts that got generated, what we really have is a really positive setup for the first 15 days of July. And what we've seen right now is the NASDAQ has been up 8 weeks in a row. We haven't had the NASDAQ up 8 weeks in a row since 2020. So that's a positive. But we have to realize that this is a really positive setup right here. And what we need to see is not an erosion back down for the balance of the summer. This reflects right here how strong July is as a market indicate, as a month in the market. And well, we can see the past 10 years has been really good. Midterm cycle years are really good. Midterm election years. And this is where we can see the midterm election year, the gray bar, how significant that has been in the fourth quarter of this year. So now what we also want to think about now, seasonality-wise, how has Apple performed? Well, Apple always releases their big conference at the end of September, early October. They bring a lot of new products out. Well, you can't necessarily buy it right in front of that, but what we've seen over the last 10 years is that July and August have been the months where Apple outperforms the market as a whole better than any other month. And that's probably because people are starting to accumulate Apple stock in anticipation of some positive release that comes in that conference in late September, early October. You can't necessarily buy it right in front. The market's already kind of got that in its mind. So if we want to think about Apple outperforming, this is a period where it's done really well, generally speaking. And if we look at Apple, okay, over the last, say, 4 years, we can see how we're underperforming this year, but how we've done before in the second half of the year. We've typically tended to do positively. And then when we go back and we look at it over that whole 10-year window, and we can see where we are this year, okay, all but basically 1 year, Apple's had a positive return. There's another year where it's down slightly. But Apple's had a positive return, and the bias is not negative during that second half of the year. So I think what we want to think about is, if we believe the market's going to go up, and we have a market leader that has a good setup going forward, this could be an interesting time to own Apple stock.
좋아요, 구독!